Dear participants, dear experts, thank you for taking the time today to join us for this panel discussion on the continuing threat posed by ISIS towards returning fighters and their repatriation. Since 2019, ISIS fighters and their associates have been held in prison camps in northeast Syria by the Syrian Democratic Forces. About 70,000 women and children, relatives of ISIS fighters, have been held in Al-Hol and Al-Roj camps. Despite calls from the US, UN, and international human rights organizations to repatriate, for countries to repatriate their citizens, very few have done so. Today, we want to discuss the options available to ensure that foreign fighters and their affiliates still being held do not become a threat to international peace. Therefore, we are honored to welcome three distinguished experts to help us understand this complex issue. Dr. Edward Lemon, Research Assistant Professor at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Adrian Shitouni, CEO at Shitouni Consulting and Senior Research Fellow at Hidayah. Nufal Aboud, Executive Director of the Nordic Center for Conflict Transformation. Thank you all so much for being here and partaking in this panel discussion. This panel discussion has been organized by the Bulan Institute for Peace Innovations. The Bulan Institute is a research institute based in Geneva, Switzerland, with a regional office in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Our mission is to promote peace, security, and human rights in Central Asia, Eurasia, and South Asia through research, advocacy, and dialogue. We will first listen to the presentations from our experts who will present different options with how to deal with ISIS fighters and their associates in a humane fashion. We will follow their presentations with a question and answer session. The experts will be asked the questions provided by our participants. If you have a question to ask, please let us know in the Zoom chat on the right-hand side of your screen. I would like to add that our session is being live streamed to Facebook, will be recorded to share with our partners, and will be posted on our website. To all participants, please keep your microphones and cameras off for the entirety of the panel discussion. Our first presentation will be from Dr. Edward Lemon. Dr. Lemon is a research assistant professor within the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service in Washington, D.C. He has previously served as a global fellow at the Wilson Center and earned his PhD from the University of Exeter in 2016. Dr. Lemon's research is focused on the transnational dimensions of authoritarianism, notably in Central Asia, Russia, and China. He recently published the book, Critical Approaches to Security in Central Asia in 2018, and is considered an important expert in this field. Thank you very much for being here with us, Dr. Lemon. Dr. Lemon, you've recently published several articles about the foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon in Central Asia. Given your academic background, could you give us an insight into the motivations of foreign fighters when they joined ISIS from Central Asia? What were the endemic issues that drove that decision? And do you feel that former fighters and their families would be able to reintegrate into these societies peacefully?
Yeah, so I think, as in other parts of the world, this is a very complex problem set. There's been a number of research done by myself and others looking at the motivations for joining Islamic State. If we look at the scale from Central Asia, we had the lower estimates from the government and other independent sources pointed to around 2,500 people from the region traveling to Syria and Iraq. The higher estimates pushing towards more like 7,000 individuals. If we include the figures from the Turkish government of those who were stopped at the border, that number rises to 11,000. So we saw a relatively large number of people proportionally traveling to Syria and Iraq from Central Asia, Tajikistan, with 1,900, an estimated 1,900 individuals. Joining groups in Syria and Iraq was amongst the highest per capita in the world. I think third highest after Tunisia and the Maldives. So certainly it was a phenomenon that shook the region, even though the threat didn't manifest itself so much in the region itself, but often in attacks that took place abroad. In terms of the drivers, at the individual level, there's certain drivers, including repression. The region is populated by authoritarian governments who have very strict secular regimes, It has certain minority groups, such as Uzbek minorities in Kyrgyzstan, that are repressed by the government and are exist in a situation of inequality. And certainly some of our research, including prison interviews in Kyrgyzstan, point towards specific grievances around corruption, about ethnic discrimination being push factors towards groups such as Islamic State. I think one of the other overarching factors that led people to join terrorist organizations was networks. We had entire villages from Tajikistan, from central Kazakhstan, where one or two individuals mobilized, and they eventually brought within their networks, be they family or informal networks, they dragged in various other people from those communities. Another important variable within the Central Asian context was migration. Central Asia is one of the most migration-dependent parts of the world, with around a third of the economies of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan being based on migrant labor, and around about 2 million Uzbek citizens from Uzbekistan living in Russia. So we have around 5 million migrants, much of the working age male population living as migrants abroad, and both in Russia, they've had more access and exposure to recruiters, and at the same time were living far from home. Their social networks had been disrupted by the migration processes, and that led to a large number of those who mobilized to Syria and Iraq from Central Asia, doing so from migration. So I think factors such as poverty, such as lack of education, don't seem to have played a particularly strong role in many cases. We have individuals who are highly educated going to Syria from Moscow State University, for example. We have individuals who are the children of members of the elite of the government, who had occupied relatively prominent positions in society, also mobilizing. So I think it's obviously a very complex picture, and it's difficult to say if there was one push or pull factor, but those are some of the ones that have been identified within the research. In terms of the efforts by governments from the region to repatriate citizens, Central Asia has taken the lead, as Cholpon said, in repatriating citizens. It was Tajikistan back in 2015 that was the first to announce an amnesty, whereby they said if you are in Syria and Iraq or have been in Syria and Iraq and you repent and admit your wrongdoing, in the government's words, that you will be permitted back into the country and you can serve a period of house arrest. And so we saw around 300 individuals taking advantage of that amnesty scheme that was quite decentralized and disorganized, insofar as people often would just turn up at the consulate in Istanbul, and they would turn themselves in, and then often it was family members who had to bear the costs of repatriation. We've seen much more organized efforts of late, starting in 2019 with Kazakhstan's Operation Juzan, where they've been repatriating people on special flights from Syria in particular. And we've seen approximately 700 individuals having been repatriated through that program by the end of 2020, according to the government statistics. And they've been very well publicized, and there's various, you can watch various very high quality documentaries and news pieces published by the security services of Kazakhstan, demonstrating both the repatriation efforts and some of the rehabilitation efforts. So it certainly plays into government external branding and propaganda efforts that we can touch on later. Uzbekistan, as Chopin said, is also shortly after Kazakhstan began repatriating citizens, Uzbekistan also did the same, bringing back 156 women and children in the first half of 2019, and then a further 220 last year, despite the pandemic, and most recently, as she mentioned in the introduction, 191 citizens. In most of these cases, this is still quite gendered. This is focused on repatriating women and children, although some men have also been repatriated, many of whom have faced criminal charges upon return. Kyrgyzstan has started repatriating people very recently. It's been the slowest and took the longest to come up with a firm policy on repatriation. But as Cholpon said, they've repatriated 74 women and children. Reports vary, 74 or 79 children at the beginning of this year, around March. So certainly the governments of Central Asia have been taking an approach that is in stark contrast to many liberal democracies, and they've certainly been very keen to point this out and to portray themselves as being at the cutting edge of repatriation efforts. What happens when the people get home? How effective is de-radicalization and rehabilitation programs? There are more question marks there. Kazakhstan has set up 17 regional support centers, often in Soviet-era sanatoriums. Uzbekistan has set up similar centers. There are some question marks over precisely what's going on in those centers. The focus still remains in a very Soviet way on this behavioralist concept of radicalization that points to the way in which individuals, the way in which extremism and radicalization is a disease or a disorder that can be cured through purely psychological correction, including exposure to a notion of a true Islam, whatever that means. And so we have certain evidence from videos that they put out that the evidence of success was that people took off their black clothing, they took off their niqab, they dressed in secular clothing, and they, by doing so, that already indicated they were cured of the disease of radicalization, of being extremist. So there are certainly concerns over, this isn't just unique to Kazakhstan. De-radicalization, as everyone knows, is a very difficult process, but there are certain concerns over the efficacy of this, and there certainly are concerns based on survey data that we collected in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan around the threat of returnees. There's certainly a lot more support for women and children who are viewed as being more innocent in the process, and have been often, in many people's popular imagination, bystanders or coerced into going to Syria and Iraq, or obviously as children being born or not able to obviously play a role in that decision-making process. But particularly there's concern amongst the return of men and what impact those will have in their community. The governments have been making efforts such as issuing people with new identities and passports to allow people to reintegrate, but there's still, from the evidence that we have, quite a lot of tension and animosity between those in the community and those who've returned from Syria and Iraq. So I think, to summarize, on the one hand, I think it's certainly laudable, the efforts that the governments, particularly of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, have been engaging and in repatriating citizens, in attempting to find ways to reintegrate them into society. I think there's been some lack of transparency, from my understanding, with cooperating with certain international bodies. Certainly the UN bodies have been involved in this process, but there's been a certain lack of transparency in precisely what's going on in these rehabilitation centers. And obviously there'll be certain challenges with reintegrating these fighters or these returnees going forward. But I think it's certainly laudable that the effort is being made to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Lemon. Yes, that was a very fascinating introduction. And yes, it's very interesting that Central Asia has been taking a leading role, especially when you consider that many other countries have more resources and more contacts and more ways to access their population. So certainly an example to be followed. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Our second presentation will be from Mr. Adrian Shitouni, CEO and Principal Consultant of Shitouni Consulting and Senior Research Fellow at Hedaya. Hedaya is an international organization focused on countering violent extremism by enhancing understanding and sharing of good practices to effectively build the capacity of actors around the globe involved in countering violent extremism. Shitouni Consulting is a foreign policy, strategic communications and security consultancy focused on the Western Balkans. Mr. Shitouni has been a consultant for government agencies, academic institutions, and international organizations around the world, and we are honored to have him with us today. Mr. Shitouni, knowing your expertise on the Balkan region, we would like to learn about the state policies towards ISIS fighters and their associates there. Is it a similar situation to Central Asia? And could you provide us the same kind of background and understanding to what were the push and pull factors for these people to join ISIS in Syria? What is the current situation as well in Kosovo? Because Kosovo has already repatriated over 100 women and children, and we'd be delighted to hear of that experience.
Sure. First and foremost, I wanted to thank Bulan Institute for inviting me to be part of this important and timely panel on a very critical issue, together with my esteemed colleagues here. So thank you. And thank you for shining a light on this problem that sometimes is kind of forgotten, although the more we forget about this problem, and especially the people that are left in those camps and prisons, the more we are exposing ourselves to the future threat of another wave of radicalization. So by addressing this issue, we're not doing a favor to anyone but ourselves. So need to talk a lot more about this, and not just talk, but do something about it. And so thank you again for hosting this panel. In order to provide a more accurate understanding of the scale of the problem in terms of the Western Balkans when it comes to foreign fighters and their family members, I will start by giving you some numbers. Starting from 2012, some 1,070 citizens of the Western Balkans traveled to Syria and Iraq. They mostly joined terrorist organizations or traveled to migrate there and live in territories under their control. And it is an important distinction, because not all people who travel to Syria and Iraq are foreign fighters. There's those that just went there for hijrah, and of course they did provide support directly or indirectly to terrorist organizations, but there are some distinctions and categories. Whereas the children, by and large, were there without their own accord. They were taken there by their parents, not to talk about the ones that were born there. So children, first and foremost, need to be treated as victims. So I just wanted to emphasize the number, because it might not look as a big number, 1,070, when we are looking at, for example, Central Asia's numbers. But we have to consider the population size of countries of the Western Balkans as well. So in order to give you that perspective more clearly, because again, Western Balkans is in Europe. So I will compare it a little bit with the numbers in Europe. So if we're looking at Western Europe, there is an estimate of about 5,000 individuals from Western Europe that have traveled to Syria and Iraq. Compare it to Western Balkans, 1,070. By keeping in mind that the population of the Western Balkans, of the 6 countries composing the region, which means Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, the population of these 6 countries in total is less than 18 million. So if we're looking, whereas the Western Europe, we're talking about 530 million. So if we're looking at the rate of recruitment and mobilization in the Western Balkans is 6 times higher than the rest of Europe, 6 times higher. But then when you're looking at the resources available in the countries of the Western Balkans, you will see that the GDP per capita, it's a lot lower, uncomparable to what the resources are in Western Europe. And yet, the countries of the Western Balkans have been at the forefront of repatriating their citizens in Europe. Of course, the numbers don't compare again to Central Asia because of the size of the problem, but they have been rather proactive in the Western Balkans when it comes to repatriating, especially women and children. But I'll talk about that a little later. In terms of demographics, I wanted to emphasize this. In terms of demographics, at the time of departure, about 2/3 of those who departed were men of military age. So were men at the time that they departed, whereas the rest, 18% were children and 15% were women. So they would compose about 1/3 of the total contingent that left the region. If we fast forward to 2021, right now, the size of demographics has changed. That is partially because men have been killed in battle and there's been a lot more children born there. If we're adding the number of children born to the original contingent, the number of people from the Western Balkans who have spent some time in Syria and Iraq in the past decade goes up to 1,300 plus. Some 350 individuals in the meantime have been killed in battle, or they have died of natural causes. About 450 remain in Syria and Iraq, including those born there, two-thirds of whom are children and women. And they're primarily kept in IDP camps and prisons in Syria. About 500 is the number of individuals who have either returned by themselves over the years or have been repatriated. The number of repatriation is a lot smaller, but I'll give you the numbers a bit later on that. But definitely this makes this 500, the number 500 makes the Western Balkans the region with the highest concentration of returning foreign terrorist fighters and family members from Syria and Iraq to Europe. So that the concentration is much higher than anywhere else in Europe of these returnees. The most policy relevant, I think, trend that I would emphasize when it comes to demographics is that currently the contingent of remaining individuals who travel to Syria and Iraq from the Western Balkans is dominated for over 51% by non-combatants, which means children and women. So the trend has changed from 2/3 being 76% was men in the beginning. Now that has shrunk to about less than 49%. So why am I emphasizing this? Because again, and reasonably so, we consider foreign terrorist fighters to represent the biggest security risk, and they, the foreign fighters attract more attention when it comes to research and policies and funding and all of that. But if we're looking at the demographics and the numbers, it is clear that children primarily and women should not be an afterthought, but should demand, the problem demands a lot more attention and a lot more funding to deal with this problem. And this should help prevent future radicalization, especially considering that resources and capacities in the countries of the Western Balkans are very limited and disproportionate, as I mentioned, to the scope and size of the challenge. Regarding the situation in the IDP camps, I mentioned there's 450 remaining citizens of the Western Balkans, primarily in these IDP camps, but there's still, from this 450, there's still a small number that are active with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in the Idlib area. So they're not all in prisons or in IDP camps, but some continue to fight and some are in the surrounding area there. But mostly they are housed in Al-Hol and Roj. We know the situation in Al-Hol. I can talk about it later if we have time, but the situation is despicable. It is really harmful, and it will contribute to added trauma and possible radicalization to those children that are being kept there for more than 2 years at this point. But we can touch upon that a little bit later if there is any questions in the interest of time, because I wanted to get to the part about prosecution and what's being done to rehabilitate and reintegrate. So in terms of repatriations, as I mentioned, the countries of the Western Balkans are the only ones in Europe to have made the decision of becoming proactive in repatriating in large numbers. And Kosovo led the charge in this sense. They repatriated about 110 citizens with the support of the United States. Bosnia has repatriated about 26, North Macedonia 10, and Albania 6. I'm not aware of anyone being repatriated in Serbia or by Montenegro. The countries of Western Balkans also are different in terms of if compared to other countries in Europe, because they're the only ones in Europe to have willingly and publicly repatriated fighters, known fighters. And that is a small number, but it's about 20 out of all the 150 citizens that have been repatriated. But they're the only ones to have done so. In terms of prosecution, Bosnia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia, so the 3 out of 6 countries of the Western Balkans, have achieved a high rate of prosecution for adult returnees from Syria. But I must emphasize that the sentences have been mostly lenient and have bordered on the minimum prison term provided for in the criminal codes of the respective countries. This raises questions on whether the intended deterrent effect of incarceration can be achieved by such sentences, such very low sentences, especially when they are not matched by significant rehabilitation and reintegration programs in prisons and outside prisons. Most of these repatriated militants that have been sentenced will be released in the next couple of years. So the window of opportunity to work with them is kind of closing, and it's very small. In terms of women, Kosovo, for example, that has repatriated the largest number of women, has charged most of them with terrorism offenses, namely for joining the Islamic State. They have been found guilty and they have received 2-year suspended sentences, which means they served no prison term. Bosnia has not charged any of the ones that were repatriated. This, in a way, it is problematic. I'm going to touch upon it a little later if there is questions, but it is problematic in that this kind of uniform approach to women, which is completely different from men for the same exact crimes, because they've been charged for the same crime of joining a terrorist organization. It is discriminatory in a way, and I don't think it helps because, again, justice has to be blind and should not be determined based on gender considerations. But we need to look at the evidence and see who's done what. And if there is evidence to prosecute individuals for committing a crime, then they should receive sentences that are commensurate with the severity of the crime that they have committed and the evidence that is presented in trials, not based on gender considerations. But this is something to discuss later during the Q&A. So what is being done in terms of rehabilitation or integration? I think there's some good initial steps that have been taken across the region. Albania has established a coordination center for CVE in late 2017. And according to information that I have received, they have set up multidisciplinary teams that will provide psychosocial assistance to 5 individuals that they have repatriated. So it's a small number. There's more to be repatriated, but I'm hearing that they're preparing to do more repatriation, but without providing a date on when or a time. In North Macedonia also has received has adopted a national plan that has received some positive reviews by experts. I have yet to see anything specific about what that plan looks like, national plan looks like. And here I'm going to highlight another problem, that there is a lot of secrecy around this programs, plans, and so on, and completely understandable because in a way, again, this problem set is closely tied to national security, but it doesn't have to be so secretive when it comes to plans to rehabilitate people and because it is important to communicate with the communities that are receiving these returnees about what is being actually done to help them, which means what is actually being done to keep those communities safe once these individuals are repatriated. So even in terms of the strategic communications, it's important to be more transparent, more inclusive, and to communicate a lot more often with audiences. Kosovo has arguably made the most progress in developing the strategic frameworks, coordination mechanisms, but also the relevant institutional infrastructure to address the rehabilitation and reintegration of these individuals that have been repatriated. They established a division for prevention and rehabilitation and reintegration, actually, within the Kosovo Ministry of Interior Affairs. Now, whether the Ministry of Interior Affairs is the most appropriate institution to house this reintegration effort, I have my questions about that. Because again, it's the Ministry of Interior Affairs. There's probably better ministries that could handle that, but that's their decision. But whatever, moving past the decision, I think there has been some good efforts that I'm aware of in terms of managing this rehabilitation and reintegration efforts that are currently led by psychiatrists, social workers, and other first-line practitioners in coordination with law enforcement entities and families of returnees and the local government authorities. Returnees have shown signs of PTSD. This is completely expected, especially the children. Signs of anxiety, hypervigilance, forms of depression, panic triggered by loud noises, especially airplanes flying overhead or firecrackers. There has been expected, again, developmental delays that have been observed because, again, the children have not gone to school regularly and they missed out on being children, frankly speaking. They've been traumatized by what they have witnessed, the violence, the bombs, all of that. So that has been a bit of an issue, but of course, this is something that was expected. There have been dedicated teams of mental health practitioners who are following and helping these children. Of course, COVID-19 has been has delayed the support provided for obvious reasons in a way. Women have received, most of these 32 repatriated women have received parenting training and have been enlisted in skills development programs, including sewing and cooking courses in order to enhance their chances of employment. Now, where are the data? There's no data to show that that has been effective in any way in employing any of this or these women returnees. But again, it is a very good thing that they're trying to enhance their employment opportunities. There has been no reporting, unfortunately, on the progress of rehabilitation reintegration initiatives. But nevertheless, the feedback has been somewhat positive, which is encouraging. Hopefully we'll see more of that. But going forward, it is important to continue working not only with those repatriated from Syria, because I've seen a lot of the focus on the repatriated from Syria, but also we need to work with those that have been convicted of their terrorism offenses and their family members, although they might have not traveled successfully to Syria and Iraq, because the pool of those individuals, as Edward also mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of them who were actually arrested in Turkey. And then, so they did not cross the Rubicon, metaphorically speaking, although they did not join ISIS or any other terrorist organization operating in Syria and Iraq, based on their commitment, the commitment they have shown, they are as radicalized as the people who actually cross the border in one way. And so we need to also work with them and work with people that have been arrested for recruiting, funding, efforts to recruit people, and so on and so forth, because the pool is bigger than just the returnees from Syria and Iraq. And if we need to look at the problem holistically and tackle it holistically, we need to look at all of them. With regards to the children that compose the bulk of returnees, it is important to adopt a holistic psychosocial support strategy, addressing all aspects of their social integration. And what I mean by that is at home, in schools, but also in the community setting. And so to conclude this remarks that I had, programs should provide, any programs to rehabilitate and reintegrate should provide wider support to address issues of radicalization to violence and issues of trauma within the whole family of returnees, to include also those receiving the returnees, because sometimes the whole families have been radicalized, despite the fact that only a few members of the family have traveled to Syria and Iraq. There is issues of radicalization or embracing a starkly radical ideology within the whole setting. And so that will affect one way or another any efforts that are put in place to rehabilitate and reintegrate those children. Teachers also are an important component of this puzzle, and they need to receive trauma awareness trainings. They need to receive some kind of training in order to be able to pick up on signs of radicalization and to know how to work in a constructive way with children that have been returned and are integrated in the schooling system, so that they're not ostracized, so that they're not put aside and pushed to become more radical. And finally, I mean, concerns of receiving communities should also be given sufficient attention, should receive some attention, and they need to be addressed concurrently with the provision of assistance to returnees, because again, these individuals are returning in relatively poor communities, in providing support to returnees, but not providing support to people who never left, can create problems internally within the dynamics of communities, and can create stigmatization and potential marginalization of returnees. So we need to keep all of this in consideration. These were quick remarks. Happy to address more in depth any of this during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shitouni. That's really interesting. We can really have a contrast with Central Asia. There are some similarities there. A lot of secrecy, not a lot of transparency with these programs. It's very interesting. And the points you're making about how we should reintegrate children and women, it's really important and very well said. I would like to, again, remind our participants that if ever they want to ask questions for the speakers that have spoken today and participate, please leave us a question in the Zoom chat. Our third presentation will be from Mr. Nufal Aboud, Executive Director and co-founder of the Nordic Center for Conflict Transformation. The Nordic Center generates progress towards the normalization of positive and lasting peace globally by working with individuals, groups, communities, civil society, and government institutions to develop a culture of peace that is embedded in justice, with the full respect of human rights and nonviolence as a way of life. Mr. Aboud previously worked as the Morocco Country Director for the Search for Common Ground NGO, focusing on building sustainable peace solutions. He is a recognized expert with many years of experience in the field of community resilience and is often invited to provide his expertise for the media and international organizations. Thank you, Mr. Aboud, for being with us here today and for sharing that very sought-after expertise. Mr. Aboud, we've had the perspective from Central Asia and from the Western Balkans, I was wondering, given your background, if you could give us an insight into the MENA, Middle East and North Africa region. Notably, if you could also help us decipher some of the drivers. Are there any particularities in comparison to these other regions? And have there been any repatriations? Have there been any state policies that you can dissect in the region? And are there any best practices that we can take away from it?
Thank you, Cooper, for your flattering words about me. Thank you for the Bulan Institute and for Chopin for inviting me, most importantly, to learn from the panelists, Edward, Adrian, but also from the audience. Yes, Cooper, you mentioned that I'm expert on the issue. This is the least I can say about myself. I am actually here to learn. And I must say that we are not there yet to claim yet an expertise in the field. We're still working on how to resolve this issue. And yes, I have 3 points to make very quickly in terms of the topics. And then I can embed it, some of the remarks in terms of the experience precisely that we have in the MENA region, and most importantly, the experience in Morocco, in which I claim that have more chances to succeed because of some historical background and some decisions that have been taken. 3 points that I would like to make, and true to be said, is we are not there yet in terms of the issue of the threat of ISIS and the returning fighters and their repatriation. First, the threat of ISIS and the issue of returnees, questions actually the efficiency and effectiveness of the counterterrorism field. That's the first point that I would like to make. I will be speaking about the criminal justice proceedings and processes and the idea of evidence, and also the play out of the nationality. Second point I would like to make is that the issue also I put question marks about the idea of toolkits and toolboxes that to be claimed in the field of peace building, because even the strategies of the peace building has been inherited from what was happening in the Cold War era, and I think it's time to look for a new generation of peace builders. They look into consideration not only non-violent movements, but also some key component, which is actually the justice, criminal justice here, and the full realization of human rights. The third point that I would like to make is in relation to the collaboration, that there is more need of collaboration and effectiveness with the idea of rehabilitation and reintegration. That this idea of rehabilitation and reintegration cannot occur within a framework of crisis, but can only happen sustainably with the idea that we need to do this on an everyday basis. To do so, 3 components are major, which is not only looking for a non-violent movement or non-violence from these people who are returning, but also make sure that the delivery of justice is right and that the respect of full human rights is done. The absence of these 3 components, one component of these 3 can only backfire on us. So I'll try to make this point as fast as I can. And I will start first why these people we are so worried about returnees. Yes, we have to worry because first of all, these people have been molded in violent ideologies. They have been trained in making bombs and build networks, plan and execute terrorist plans. And the third point is that, which is very important, is that they have raised their tolerance to violence significantly. While we will see this kind of fear against returnees shape some decisions of some countries, whether they want to have them or not. And that's why there is a reluctance in some countries to actually repatriate these people, knowing that after all, this is an international phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon of a region. It's a global problem, and a global problem that have been embedded with the idea of nationality and the international customary law and human rights law, to admit a person into a state depends primarily on nationality. So the essence of nationality as an institution of domestic law has consequences on the international arena, and lays the ground, actually, the duty to admit, the states have the duty to admit the citizens according to the international law in their territories. And of course, this is an obligation of state that is balanced by the state sovereignty. So we have to know this kind of, that it's not only that states have the effort to repatriate their citizens, but they have actually the obligation. And this comes, for example, on the Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that states that everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country. And also in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 45, that says actually provide that no one should be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his or her own country. So there have been a lot of talks about the denationalization as the legitimate policy instrument, revoking nationality of people who left to ISIS has been used as a measure to prevent the return of this foreign terrorist fighters, FTFs, which in my opinion is a violation of international human rights law. The privation of nationality clearly comes into play with regard to repatriations of these FTFs and their families. And resorting to this action actually is a way to try for state to try to really release themselves from the obligation actually to proactively seek the return of their nationals. There is the famous case of Shamima Begum, a British citizen who actually have been seen, by, that Britain has decided to deprive her from her British citizenship. And the decision has been actually backed by the Supreme Court in Britain, and she could not even enter to appeal the decision. This is a case that we have to look into as well. Concerns has been expressed by the Secretary of the United Nations, and the reason why he signed the key principles for the protection and repatriation, persecution, rehabilitation, reintegration of women and children, which highlight that any repatriation efforts need to consider humanitarian and human rights standards. For me, these, even though the Secretary General of the United Nations here focused on repatriation of women and children, there is a clear international principle in relation to the proximity of the detention institutions and prisons, that it doesn't serve anything to keep the father, for example, detained somewhere else outside the country while the family is somewhere else. This is, again, one of the principles that exists in domestic law. And I don't think international human rights law has imposed that it should be isolation of terrorist foreign fighters to be detained somewhere else. We all should learn from the failure of Guantanamo Bay and how isolation of foreign terrorist fighters and away from their family actually can only backfire on us. So that's one of the points. The second point, here, we speak about terrorist foreign fighters and returnees as being one kind. And the numbers have been shifting. There is always, for example, we said that ISIS had in their heights between 27,000 and 42,000 foreign terrorist fighters at their disposal. The difference between the two numbers is huge. And until today, I have some questions about numbers and how we calculate numbers. And we know that there are at least three categories of foreign fighters: those who perished, who died, those who stayed, and those who returned. So it's very important to differentiate these categories. most importantly is that I would like to add another category, which is very important, that I believe that there are many of those terrorist fighters will never go home. And instead, they will prefer to be dying in other combats and joining new military campaigns. So it's a new category that I'll call them, for example, those who relocate, or al-muhajirun. They will be shipped in from different places. We have seen this, for example, in the conflict in Libya, and how after the decision of the United Nations that all foreign fighters need to leave the country, we have seen them, go into other countries, mostly in the Sahel region, and which I consider that the Sahel region is becoming the new command of ISIS, focusing more in Southern Africa. We have seen, for example, the role perhaps in way or another in Mozambique, and perhaps, we don't know yet, their infiltration also in Chad, knowing that a lot of Chadians were in southern Libya in the fight over there. One of the major points here that I would like to pinpoint in relation to the lack of effectiveness of the counterterrorism is the issue of evidence. It is difficult to collect evidence against these people. I'm afraid to say most of them, it's very hard to collect evidence against most of them. Why? First of all, it's because most countries are not there. They're not in Iraq, Syria. Many countries in the European Union, African Union, or North Africans are not present in Syria or Iraq. A second thing is that a lot of countries do not have a cooperative relationship with the Assad regime, and therefore the data and intelligence, they cannot have the data and intelligence to permit them to have the evidence against these people. Most of the people actually that have been caught up in this are those who perhaps posted the pictures with the flag of ISIS in the background, but this is not enough in judicial and solid judicial persecution. So the question remains within the efforts of counterterrorism is that how can we prove their involvement in terrorist organizations? We know that less cases will go to court. And even those cases, if they go to court, the sentence mostly at the max is 10 years. So eventually these people will be out of prison. So what are we doing, to receive them and to work with this category? Another point in the MENA region, we have to contextualize actually how these people were leaving to Iraq, and especially to Syria. And this is how the media, was showing the brutal crackdown of Assad regime on citizens and people in Syria, and the images and the reporting from international media in one way or another have triggered the wave of angry women and men, seeing some of whom, went to Syria with the intent, I think, to support people movement against the regime at that time. And then, Jabhat al-Nusra was present, but I think that most of the people did not know what Jabhat al-Nusra is all about. They knew Al-Qaeda, they knew Daesh, but their intent was perhaps this is a movement, democratic movement, and so forth like that. My talks with several people who actually came back and who have been in contact with people, they didn't know exactly what the Jabhat al-Nusra means to them. So the idea of proving the intent of joining a terrorist organization would at times be very, very nuanced. So this is one of, so the majority of the returnees, will find it hard, to prove, to have that evidence, to persecute them, and we will need to start to think about alternatives. And also, if these people do not think that they will be going through an independent and effective judicial process, like Gilles de Kerchove, the EU counterterrorism coordinator, put it, he said, what kind of message are we giving to these people? It will be hard to get them back, even those who did not go with the intent to fight with the terrorist organizations. And we have seen, for example, some of that is that, foreign fighters in Libya and other people in Libya, they will prefer to go somewhere else than come back home. And we have to learn also from, because we do not have alternative for mujahideen in Afghanistan, we have seen what that led to in terms of returnees, and we did not have a plan, and how the messages of coming home and be in prison is not really the right one. While we know that the criminal process and criminal justice has to take its course, we have to make sure that we have the truth about everyone that we persecute, and will not put everyone in the same basket. We need to differentiate these fighters and these returnees in general. And the third point that I would like to make is in relation to the peace building field, claiming that we have a toolkit and or toolbox in relation to rehabilitation or integration of these returnees, I must say that we are not there yet. These toolkits who say that it's only with the contextual tweaks they can work. No, I think that we still don't have a global strategy to deal with these returnees. We do not have even regional strategies of returnees. What we have is scattered country experiences, not without errors, but a lot to learn from. We, for example, have this idea that the approaches are so wide, in terms of what a state practices. For example, we can go from the British experience and British model that focuses on, as long as we keep these terrorist fighters away from Britain, it's good. And even if it has to take us to deprive them from the British nationality, as long as we keep them away, it's good. And we have, for example, the experience, the other extreme of the approach, which is the Danish experience in relation to more humane and more focusing on rehabilitation or reintegration, and keeping away the criminal persecution a little bit, with less focus on that. They have the experience in the region of Aarhus in Denmark, but there are other experiences in between. And I would like to speak later on quickly about the experience in Morocco. So the framework on dealing with returnees, we have to decide whether we're going to have a retrospective framework which focuses on punishment, or are we looking at a prospective framework which focuses more on knowing the truth and rehabilitate these people so they become normal citizens. The experience in Morocco here, and I said before that Morocco has the prerequisites for perhaps a successful model for rehabilitation and integration, is because Morocco has decided a long time ago to deal with the human rights violation, the 42 human rights violations under previous regime, using the transitional justice and reconciliation process. The idea of accepting to enter into dialogue with those with whom we do not agree with, and those who we might consider as enemies, but we're still gonna sit down on the table. But the most important thing for that experience is getting to know the truth and not only focus on the punishment, perhaps with the idea to build a legal system without punishment. Morocco has taken the responsibilities to repatriate all their citizens. Of course, with the COVID and so forth like that, this has stopped in March 2019 with the idea of, they need to have other priorities such as COVID. The numbers that have been given so far is that there is 1,654 Moroccans who left. There are 225 who had criminal records, 288 women from whom 99 have returned, 745 who died in the conflicts over there, and there is 391 children with whom 82 have returned. Some other numbers they give, like 190 children only instead of 391. So the numbers are discussable because, of course, the idea of intent and so forth. So I think one of the ideas that will be out there is how can we think about the returnees, not only from the idea of punishment, but also looking prospectively, not only women and children, but also for the entire family. So as a conclusion, I would say that there is much of appeal for hard approaches of persecution, but these hard approaches, they are limited in terms of the evidence and in terms of state responsibilities to repatriate their citizens. However, a main key issue here is to learn from each other. We need to evaluate properly the country experiences, not with the idea to say what works, because what is important in this field and the return is actually to discuss really what doesn't work, and to be able to do that and learn from it, we need to take off the burden off the shoulders of experts by saying, it is okay that we share what didn't work, and that it is not necessarily that expert has to be right all the time, but it's important that they share what they have missed so far and what they have learned from different experiences. So it is more than ever, the time, to face this challenging phenomenon of returning foreign fighters become much more, we need to be much more comfortable with the nuances and doubts and uncertainties of what we have done in this field so far, and also be aware of our limitation, be it in the counterterrorism field or in peace building field, and of course acknowledging that we need to move away from the idea of toolkits and toolboxes, that indeed, we still don't have a well-tested and evaluated toolkits and toolboxes, even though some of them they claim to have established them, but rather we have scattered experiences, country experiences, those scattered but yet rich to learn from. Just to conclude completely with the one sentence is that more and more we have to look at this issue, not only from the loophole of a crisis, but more and more from the idea of an everyday peace building. Thank you very much for now.
Thank you, Mr. Aboud. That was very interesting. I very much like that you provided us an insight into your non-violence philosophy, and that is very interesting as a concept. The fact that this is an everyday process that will require fundamental reforms in the long term. It's very interesting and plays into many other fundamental issues. So thank you for your presentations. We will now move on to our question and answer session. As we said before, these questions were asked from our participants in the Zoom chats. Now, our first question is for Dr. Lemon. Dr. Lemon, there's been the conversation of these returnees to Central Asia being a terrorist threat. How big would you say that threat is from returnees? And given that there is this history of terrorism and militancy in Central Asia, has the approach, the behavioralism that you mentioned in your presentation, has that approach been used in the past? And can Central Asia be an example of where they use past experiences to help reintegrate and create a better process for today's crisis?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting issue. So far, we don't have any evidence that I know that anyone who has returned through government repatriation programs has conducted or plotted any attacks. Of course, that remains a possibility. We do have evidence from Tajikistan that I think, according to local officials, of the 300 who returned through this voluntary amnesty, around about 30 or 40 of them came back and then returned to Syria and Iraq. So this was about when that was more possible, like back in 2015, 2016. So certainly that would point to this process being less successful. The vast majority of returnees thus far through repatriation programs, as I said, are women and children. I think there are question marks, and I think there is this balance that was picked up by Adrian and by Mafal around signaling, right? To what extent should, as each country in Central Asia changed its criminal code to criminalize mercenary activity. That should theoretically apply to women and men. And there is this debate around agency and like who went there knowing what they were getting themselves into. How do we classify, as we say, these distinctions between foreign fighter and those individuals who went for other purposes, or who went not knowing the full sort of consequences of what they were getting themselves in for. So I think there's the balance between wanting to punish people on the one hand, according to the law, as a signal to others to not, mobilize again, and to not, as it's been framed by some colleagues, not sort of glorify and so easily forgive those who've broken the law. But on the other hand, also wanting to, as Nafal said in his presentation, wanting to signal to people that repatriation is an option and that they should, they should view it as something that could be genuinely beneficial to them. So thus far, we haven't seen, a threat. The attacks, there've been very few attacks in the region in general. It's most violence in Central Asia has been related to other dynamics within the region. We've seen an attack in November 2019 in Tajikistan that was attributed to some people who'd been in Syria and Iraq and had crossed the border from Afghanistan, but the details were always very murky, and it was never really gotten to the bottom of whether those individuals were true returnees. So thus far, the threat has been minimal. But of course, there are concerns, and that's particularly been a concern for many locals when we were doing surveys. In 2019, there was a particular concern around male returnees being a potential threat to security. So thus far, limited evidence that they've posed a threat so far, but of course that remains a possibility.
Well, so that's interesting. Just following up on the point that you made there, what's interesting is that, so you're saying 30 to 40 Tajiks actually came back to Tajikistan and returned to Syria and Iraq. That's really fascinating. Does that mean, so these are countries with histories of authoritarianism, this is your field, obviously. Is there no government tracking? Is there no really following closely of these individuals, or is there a general trust that they will reintegrate society peacefully?
Yeah, I don't know those specific cases, how they managed to leave the country. The Tajik rehabilitation program is not very developed, and many people, have ended up under house arrest. And although the security services have a certain capacity, it's possible as well that there is this whole concept of a release valve, right? That those individuals, they would far rather they went back to Syria and Iraq and were killed there, right? Rather than them plotting attacks back home. So certainly there is some evidence from other countries in Kazakhstan as well of people knowing that individuals were planning to join terrorist organizations and not stopping them from leaving. So I think that's a potential factor in those specific cases. But yeah, in general, although states like Tajikistan are authoritarian, they have some capacity. I think a lot of the difficulty in tracking individuals and really getting precise statistics in Central Asia is related to migration. Right? People migrate to Russia, and then they're then going from Russia often to Turkey and then crossing the border into Syria and Iraq. And it's obviously very difficult to track who's moving across those borders, because it's obviously beyond their territorial jurisdiction. So I think, speak to Nafal's point, it's very difficult to get any accurate statistics. It seems like the Balkans, from Adrian's presentation, they have a firmer grip, but with the Central Asians, it's always been, the figures vary from 2,500 up to potentially like 10,000. So it's pretty wide range of estimates.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Lemon. That's very interesting. We've got a couple of questions for Mr. Shatouni. Mr. Shatouni, you mentioned, first of all, that the Western Balkans have already brought back a fair amount of repatriations, returnees. Are there any plans to bring back more, or have they been shelved permanently by COVID? And another question we received was about the prosecutions that you have conducted in the Western Balkans. What kind of evidence is used in these prosecutions, and how is it collected? Mr. Aboud notably mentioned that it's very difficult to collect evidence of crimes in these areas. So what is the record of these prosecutions, and what kind of evidence has been collected?
Very good questions. I mean, the first one is the important one that we've been struggling with. So basically, there's a lot of talk about repatriating more of, especially children. As I mentioned, the numbers are relatively high compared to what's been repatriated. So the repatriations have been about 150, but then there's 450 still in Syria and Iraq. So we do the math. As I mentioned, not all of them are in prisons or in IDP camps. Some of them are still active. So it's not possible to repatriate somebody who's still embedded with organizations that are still fighting there. The other component, though, is that some of them don't want to return. There was a case Albania sent, because I mean, there is this misconception that we need to kind of burst that bubble that everybody wants to come back. It's not true. Some of them are fully committed to dying in the lands of Sham, or to just live there under, they are, even the ones in the camps, right? There's ample evidence basically that some of these women, they just don't want to leave behind the memories of their husbands and the pledge that they made to the Caliph and the Caliphate. So we need to dispel this kind of erroneous perceptions that everyone who is there wants to return. I mean, there's plenty of videos that they've released from Al-Hol and other places. There is a specific case I wanted to mention. Albania did send people there to repatriate, officials to repatriate some of their citizens. Initially, when they left, the idea was they were going to be repatriating more, but they ended up only repatriating 5 individuals. One woman that was injured and incapacitated, she was in a wheelchair, and 4 children. The rest of them, basically, that initially the officials wanted to repatriate, actually went in hiding at the time that they learned that the government officials were there to repatriate them. And then released videos basically saying that they would much rather die there than actually come back. Again, we need to understand that some of these individuals are quite radicalized and they just, are committed to their ideology. But unfortunately, the other ones were not or want to be repatriated. They're left there. There is no specific information from any of these countries about any impending repatriation. They've been citing, obviously, the COVID restrictions. They've been citing also other issues related to, the fact that they don't know who to repatriate, because sometimes the children resulted from mixed marriages between their nationals and somebody else, and nationals of other countries. And so, first and foremost, you need to also validate that these children are who the parents supposedly say they are, and they're not. They don't belong to others. So there should be DNA testing and so on and so forth. So, and there's other complaints that have been, or let's say reasons that have been brought forward in terms of, okay, them not having travel documents, the problem of not being any consular services, the fact that, the Kurdish authorities are non-state authorities, are not arguably recognized officially, and so on and so forth. But you've heard that before. And so all of these are kind of reserved as reasons. In terms of the second question about the prosecution, I mentioned earlier that prosecution in the Balkans have been much faster and expedient in terms of prosecuting. They have the highest rates of prosecution in Europe. I saw data from the United Kingdom. Basically, they were at the 10% or something of prosecuting returnees, because as my colleagues mentioned, Nufal actually mentioned very well, that it's so hard to collect the evidence, and what is admissible in court would differ from one country to the other depending on the laws. Mainly, according to, I've followed some of the trials. What in the Balkans they've resulted to is plea bargains. Basically, they've offered this plea bargain saying, okay, admit that you did this, and then we will discount your sentence. And so that kind of, it's a tricky way, because again, in some ways, you can make people arguably admit to things they haven't done just because they just don't want to have to go through the process. And they might be like, yes, I did it. As long as I can go home, you can give me a suspended sentence. In some other cases, you know, it has been problematic, because even when there was evidence, for example, that some of these fighters had Yazidi slaves, there was no action taken. There was no, this was not reflected in the sentencing. And that's problematic, because that's a human, that's a war crime. And unfortunately, we haven't seen anyone. In Germany, we have a case, we have two cases actually, but a case of one woman that is being actually prosecuted for in relation to the death of a child that actually was Yazidi child, and it was a slave, and she died and left to die without water, or arguably her husband, but she did not provide any assistance. So there is, in some cases, there is evidence, photographic, there is evidence by witnesses saying, yes, he had a Yazidi slave, but no steps have been taken to prosecute those war crimes, unfortunately, so far. And it goes back to the point Nafal made, that it's very hard to make this evidence admissible in courts. So it's problematic.
Well, thank you for those insights. Very fascinating. Yeah, it must be very complicated, especially for the local communities, to see war criminals come back and receive lower sentences than people who commit fraud or so victimless crimes really well in comparison. Mr. Aboud, we've received a question for you that actually ties into what Mr. Shitouni was just talking about prior, was that some of these individuals, as Mr. Shitouni said, they are committed to the cause. They're ready to die. They've sworn loyalty to the caliph. They're not interested in repatriation. So what would be an effective state policy in line with nonviolence and these kind of ideas? What would be an effective state policy to handle these kinds of fighters? And would ad hoc trials, for instance, be a good option in the countries where they're fighting?
Yes, it's a very important question, and the answer is also challenging to come up with an answer. You know, an ad hoc trial, you know, we have to try it first, and then we can actually think, you know, evaluate if it works or not. But one of the things that that we have been observing is radicalized individuals. If we provide them with just pragmatic help in rebuilding their lives, it seems being essential in their you know, de-radicalization process, rather than focusing on changing their ideas. The changes of their radical ideas, it's not only difficult, but also sometimes can lead us to some kind of injustice in relation to key human rights issues, such as the freedom of thoughts and freedom of conscience. I hear, you know, the book of 1984 of George Orwell, who was speaking about the think crime, the thoughts crimes. You know, we don't want to get to that, but perhaps we need to focus more on pragmatic help for these people to rebuild their lives. In a way or another, perhaps this is the right message to send them, instead of saying, well, you all gonna come here and you all gonna go to prison. We say, well, we can provide you with some pragmatic help, and then the process, we can see the process and evaluate the process at a later stage. Of course, you know, like the idea of evidence when it comes to play, even if these people actually have radicalized ideas, is their action that is the cause of their persecution, not their thinking. And we need to make a difference in between these two. And it's becoming very hard, you know, to persecute somebody just because he has radical ideas, because of the delivery of justice, criminal justice, is not going to be there.
Well, that is really fascinating as an idea. Yes, I mean, absolutely. There are questions when prosecuting this, that there are consequences for the freedoms of thought and expression. And yes, we should definitely consider that. That's very interesting. I mean, building off with Dr. Lemon, as you mentioned, the behavioralism, the Soviet behavioralism idea that radicalization is a disease that can be cured, that can be shaped. What kind of policies specifically do you see currently in rehabilitation centers that would be in line with that idea, where they really treat radicalization like a disease?
You know, I look, you know, I've been working before on rehabilitation reintegration in the Maghreb and Sahel region under my previous mandates, talking here about Morocco, Mali, and Niger. I've been also working, you know, with communities in relation to how to deal with former extremists and so forth like that. And there are a lot of things that didn't work, and we have to be very comfortable in sharing what doesn't work. Yeah, cartoons, comic books, some messaging, and so forth like that. You know, it just didn't work because there is a distortion between the level of violent extremism and the level of countering it. When we're talking about the level of violent extremism, we're talking about violent extremism perhaps 3.0. But in terms of prevention and in terms of countering it, we're still talking about CVE or PVE 101. We're still trying things while there is a distortion between these two. Why there is a distortion, and I'm talking from a peace building perspective, is we're still using the tools of peace building that existed in Cold War, in prevention on nonviolence. And we're still exporting them here to address an issue, an emerging issue, which is very complex, very challenging, which is violent extremism, radicalization to violent extremism, returnees, and so forth. I think we need to think about reforming this field of peace building by actually thinking that we don't need to only work towards a state of nonviolence. We need to work towards the idea of effective delivery of criminal justice, and also with respect of human rights. And this is what we have been doing. And I think this is what the Bulan Institute is trying to achieve. This is what the Nordic Center is trying to do. There's a new generation of peace builders that are open-minded to other fields and other collaboration with key institutions. It's not peace building that you don't have to work with the security apparatus and so forth like that. No, we need to do that, and we need to shape each other. Rehabilitation and reintegration. We have seen, for example, that in North Africa, for example, Morocco and so forth, there is a strength in state institutions in doing so. Talking about the prison administration and some ministries and Ministry of Justice and the security apparatus. But what is interesting that we have observed is the strength of civil society organization in the Sahel region. You know, when you don't have state institutions that are solid in a country, the civil society organization rise up to that level, and they become so important in the delivery of rehabilitation and reintegration. While in countries, for example, such as Morocco, there is still a weakness on civil society organization working in the field of rehabilitation and reintegration. There is strength of state institutions who are also open to collaboration, but unfortunately, the capacity of rehabilitation and reintegration from other actors, some actors, including civil society organizations in Morocco, for example, or North Africa, or the state institutions in the Sahel region, it's not there yet. It doesn't help in elevating this level of collaboration. So we still, like I said, we still have some limitations and uncertainties in terms of the capacity of those who will be in charge of rehabilitation or integration. Once we address that, we can move forward, including in the ad hoc trials, for instance, is that who are these people who will be trying it? To what extent the idea of evidence is very important, and what are other alternatives? What we need is that the prison sentence becomes the exception. It doesn't become the rule.
Yeah.
It's a last resort. And this is the whole idea of criminal justice, is that prison is the last resort. But unfortunately, for these cases, we still could not come up to the normalcy of things, which actually we should be thinking about rehabilitation and reintegration properly.
Well, that is very fascinating, Mr. Aboud. Thank you for that. That is very interesting. Our final word will go to Dr. Lemon. Dr. Lemon, as Mr. Aboud was mentioning, we were talking about the ad hoc trials. There is a possibility that the Syrian Democratic Forces will be those that will mete out justice effectively to these individuals. Is it possible for a non-state actor to adequately give out justice? And how would that be seen, well, perhaps from your center of expertise in Central Asia, would that be seen as legitimate?
Well, I think, of course, there are question marks around the legitimacy of those trial processes in a conflict zone, in a non-democratic setting. I think trials, as we've already discussed, over extremism can be exceedingly controversial, and the evidence and the burden of evidence in each judicial system obviously varies. And so I think there are, from an international perspective, there are obviously concerns about that process of justice. I think back in Central Asia, I think there's certainly, whilst people will welcome women and children home, there's a particular opposition to welcoming men home. So I think, those who've not voluntarily returned or who are male are usually viewed as being guilty. And so I think within Central Asia, there's not a particular demand for people to return. There's an acceptance if they do on the whole. But, I think if those individuals, of course, they're members of their family back home, may have different views and their friends. But I think if those individuals are tried, then I don't think there will be a particular outcry in Central Asia, where it's still, it's viewed very much from a law and criminal justice perspective, more so than from a humanitarian perspective overall. So certainly that's part of it. So yeah, so I think they wouldn't be too controversial.
Well, so unfortunately we've run out of time, but very fascinating conversation. Thank you very much to our experts, and hopefully these touch off very important discussions for our participants that they can take away with them and can discuss with their partners and the individuals that are around them. So I would like to thank all participants for having taken the time to join us, and I would specifically like to thank Dr. Lemon, Mr. Shitouni, and Mr. Aboud for all of their professional insights and perspectives. Your contributions to this discussion were fascinating and really important, and hopefully this conversation will be able to move forward and ultimately lead to advice and ideas to policymakers who are responsible for responding to this situation. Thank you as well to all of the participants who have taken their time and who have joined us and engaged with our experts. And we will be hosting more dialogues like this in the future, so do stay tuned to the Bulan Institute. If you like this dialogue, please inform your friends and partners, and don't hesitate to reach out to us. In the meantime, I wish you all a wonderful day wherever you may be, and we look forward to hosting events with you in the future. Goodbye.